Hello and welcome to the Guest Education Global Leadership Summit. Thank you for joining us. We're pleased to introduce Charles Wood, Head of International at Century Tech. We'll talk about how Century's AI engine helps in closing the knowledge gap. We hope that you enjoy the session, and over to you, Charles.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for the introduction, Danny, and it's a real pleasure to be back here talking again. And we're excited for the rich discussion that's going to take place at the Guest Leadership Summit. So I'm just going to share my screen, and as some of you know, I presented at the previous Guest Summit, and I got some fantastic feedback from people who watched my presentation. And I talked a lot about the theoretical elements of artificial intelligence, but lots of people asked, well, what does that actually look like in practice? And I think now is the probably most apt time to talk about how we can use technology such as AI or machine learning in order to close the knowledge gap that exists in our world today. And that's going to look at sort of specifically how Century's AI works to do that. So really pleased to be talking with you all today about this. Just as a brief bit of context, Century is an 8-year-old company based out of London in the UK, and we work with schools all across the world, as well as in the UK, implementing our solution for maths, English and science from years 3 to year 11. So we're going to start by just a brief introduction. As Danny already mentioned, I'm the head of international at Century Tech. I joined 3.5 years ago, having run my own education business in Hong Kong for 5 years, but also working with the American Youth Literacy Foundation to develop mobile applications, focusing on literacy rates in the US. Since arriving at Century, I have grown the business into over 40 countries around the world. And here you can see a map of our presence, including some of the localized versions that we've deployed in different languages and with different curriculums. We're also very proud of a lot of the schools that we work with, particularly across the Middle East, where we have a presence in every Gulf state except Kuwait. And today I'm going to be drawing on a lot of the experience that we've had from working with such leading schools as those you can see on the slide here. It's probably best to start with what my views are on the way in which learning has changed. And it's really interesting that language around the closed gap and the knowledge gap that exists as a result of the pandemic is all seemingly quite new. However, I'd argue that we've been trying to close the knowledge gap that exists for over 8 years, and it's something that we've seen in the UK with schools and students. There is an enormous knowledge gap, and it's only been exacerbated by this pandemic and by the inability for students to go to schools or receive education in the normal effective way that they have. And interestingly, reading an article over the weekend, someone pointed out that actually it's going to be the bottom third in your schools that suffer the most from this. When we looked at the lockdown that happened last year, the top third of students actually lost very little learning, and that was probably due to support factors at home, as well as access to private education, whether that's tutoring or parents. The middle third caught up surprisingly quickly, and actually when they were back in school, the losses weren't enormous. But the bottom third, those students who really struggle, made huge losses, and there's been reports of how that will affect their future earnings and potential further down the line, which is just heartbreaking. And I think this comes back to the main sort of crux of why such a gap exists, and that is that the one-size-fits-all approach does not work. We know that learners learn slightly differently. They have different strengths, they have different weaknesses, they have different approaches, they have different memory function in terms of when things move from their short-term to long-term memory. And so what we're looking at is how we can design a personalized approach through the use of AI to each and every child based on those individual needs. And we're hoping that what that allows learners to do is achieve the fastest and most efficient and effective route to mastering the subject that they're studying. So that's what we're trying to do. And it's not particularly something new. It's something we've been doing for many years. And I thought that actually today the best way of showing you what that looks like and showing you how we're closing the knowledge gap is through showing you what we do with Sentry. So I'm going to actually show you what that looks like in practice and hope that the platform holds up in terms of sharing my screen. But hopefully in a second you should be able to see a login page to our school portal. And we're going to start by looking at what students do on our platform and how we're deploying AI in order to provide those children with individual pathways. So we're going to log in, and today I'd like you to imagine that we are a year 9 student, and we've logged in for the first time post-pandemic, post-lockdown, and we're going to do some catch-up work and try to work out exactly where those knowledge gaps lie. I'll just refresh as my computer seems to be whirring, but this is the pathway that's loading for our fictitious student today, who is Goodell. And Goodell, as you can see, is being made a series of recommendations in her recommended path. And those recommendations are something that we call nuggets, or bite-sized chunks of learning. And these recommendations are being drawn down from whichever courses Goodell has assigned to her. Now, in this particular account, she's assigned maths, English, science, verbal and non-verbal reasoning. These are large courses that have been designed by teachers and built by teachers in-house at Sentry. And they cover all of the English National Curriculum learning objectives. They can also be tailored and adapted to different specifications. So we work with a lot of IB schools who use this as a knowledge tool. These courses are built in such a way where they offer the breadth of a textbook, but they filter down in an individualized way for each and every child based on the child's input. Now, let's say that I've just logged in for the first time post-lockdown, we're back in school. What are we seeing at the front of my pathway? Well, we have a diagnostic assessment here. The diagnostics are used in order to diagnose what students know and what they don't know at any given time. And these are what I often refer to as the cleanest set of data that we house within Sentry, because students can only access these when their teachers set them on specific dates or as they naturally progress through the courses which they have assigned. So a lot of our schools will sit diagnostics in examination style conditions or in a controlled condition so that teachers are conscious and aware that students are completing these diagnostics by themselves. So we have a look at one in geometry. Diagnostic is made up of a series of questions. As you can see, I've been taken to the first question and I'm allowed to answer my questions through a series of exact answer, multiple choice, drag and drop questions, etc. So there are between 10 and 12 questions here, and I can answer them in my own pace. You'll notice that as I'm answering these questions, and I'm obviously not being a very diligent student here and taking my time, but as I'm answering them, I don't get any feedback from the system at all. So that's really, really important at this stage. With the diagnostic, we are not telling students that they are bad in specific areas, they don't know specific areas. We're just using that as information in order to work out where those knowledge gaps lie. So really important that we don't give feedback to students at this stage. But of course, as we'll see in a second, all of that data is collected and presented for the teacher. I'm not going to complete this one. I'm going to go back to my pathway, and I'd like you to imagine that we have just completed diagnostic assessments in mathematics, English, and science as per the units that we're covering. I now get a series of recommendations. And this time, instead of being recommended questions, I do have questions, but I also have learning materials and content. And so this time, Sentry will now recommend a learning opportunity for the individual users. And that can come in a variety of forms. It can be content that's static, it can be sort of examples of questions, but it can also be videos. And so for every single learning objective that we built in Sentry, I think there are close to 5,500 now, we have mini videos of
geometric vectors
explaining the concept. So this is Helen, a former head of maths that works for us now. And Helen has taught mathematics for many years, obviously, and we'll walk through this particular topic, introducing any prerequisite knowledge, scaffolding up the different elements that are involved in this case, geometric vectors, and then providing worked examples. So there are lots of opportunities for the students to practice, to understand how to apply this knowledge in different settings. And the students can consume this in their own pace. They can skip it, they can pause it, they can flick between the two different types of learning material, but it's the idea of giving students the opportunity to consume content at their own pace and based on their own preference. So as the student consumes the material, what Sentry is doing in the background is looking at how long is the student spending on this? Where are they pausing? Where are they skipping? And then, of course, how does that then inform the way in which they answer these formative assessment questions at the end? Are they getting things wrong? If so, what type of feedback do we give the students? How long are they spending on that particular feedback, consuming it? Or are they moving on to the next question? And then are they getting it right or are they getting it wrong? So it's all looking at what the student is doing in order to reach that outcome, rather than simply looking at what the outcome is. And that's really, really important for Sentry and for any AI tool to understand that roadmap and journey which the student has taken in order to reach the outcome. We're also very interested in different patterns. So if a student's stuck on a question, do they go back to the learning material and use that learning material to help them answer the question? A really, really important part of learning is, as I said before, is not summative assessment. This is formative assessment, I think, in one of its purest forms, because it is assessment for learning, or assessment as learning, because the student can at any time use learning material to help them answer these questions and hopefully help them answer them correctly. I'm not doing a very good job at that at the moment. That's very important because we want to gauge what the student's confidence level is. Has this student just learned a topic? Or is this a topic that the student has been practicing for many months? Is this a new topic that the student's just been introduced to? And how are they leaning on the learning materials versus attempting those assessment questions? I always think it's really useful to think of your range of learners that you have within a classroom. Let's say that you have learner A, like Goodell, who skips through all of the learning material, doesn't get any of the questions right, and performs poorly. She hasn't looked at the video, she hasn't looked at the slideshow, and she's going to end up with 0%. You then have learner B, let's say Charles, who diligently goes through all the learning material. I watch the video, I watch the slideshow, but then I get all of the questions wrong as well. Now on paper, Goodell and myself are exactly the same. We both received 0%, but we know that behind the scenes, we've both reached that endpoint by slightly different methods. And that's really important, not only for our technology to understand where we need to plug gaps, where we need to support students, it's also really important to show that to teachers so that teachers understand engagement levels, and also how difficult that is, how difficult that material and that content is for the user, and whether they're hitting a roadblock that needs addressing. So we give a lot of feedback to students, but we also give a lot of feedback to teachers in order to help them understand where it is they need to focus on. We also take advantage of things like emotional learning agents to actually record how students are feeling at different points, whether that's activating or deactivating emotions. And of course, students can constantly try again. And in the background, we have a whole bank of alternative questions for students to practice, again, all aligned to the English National Curriculum and all designed by former teachers. And so that pathway will continue to identify roadblocks, it will identify gaps in knowledge, and it will keep trying to make recommendations to the students in order to plug those roadblocks. And that's the key difference with what we're doing and what we're doing compared to, say, a textbook or a tool that is following some sort of linear journey, or a tool that is entirely driven by the teacher. We are using that data set, using the output in order to find recommendations that will support the child and hopefully plug those gaps in knowledge. But it also works at the other end of the spectrum. You have a very confident learner who has performed very well, who is going through learning materials at a pace, or who is going through diligently but still receiving 100%. we will look for ways in which we can stretch and challenge your most able learners. And again, I think that's incredibly important in this day and age. We know that we need to encourage independent learning, agency in learning, and provide students with opportunities to go beyond what they have been set. And this is what the pathway will naturally do. It'll just push and progress them through the curriculum, or give them further opportunities to practice that. You'll also notice that the pathway is interleaved and spaced. So we're taking advantage of both of those theories. The interleaved effect in a very granular way, and often trying to make cross-curricular links between different subject areas. So obviously lots of natural links between things like physics and mathematics, but also it might make subtle links where students have been struggling with particular questions because of a language issue. Again, Sentry can pick up on things like that and try to make relevant cross-curricular recommendations. Finally, there are two further things that can be done on the pathway. One really important element, which I think is going to be hugely relied upon in terms of closing knowledge gaps, is memory boost. We know that when students learn something, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's retained in their long-term memory. And lots of schools do some incredible work practicing things like active memory recall, and taking advantage of the research that Ebbinghaus did and his forgetting curve. The memory boost feature will automatically bring learning objectives back to students over the course of the year in a timely fashion for them to see if they can recall that information effectively. So an incredibly supportive safety net, if you like, or recall spine, as I've heard it called, which is just making sure that students are attempting things and moving it from their working memory into their long-term memory. And of course, it goes without saying that teachers can take charge of this pathway and set journeys for their individual students. And as we'll see in a second, that might be in line with their schemes of work. It might be as part of an activity that they're doing, but teachers can set starting points or set entire journeys. And although this pathway is just showing you the top 10 nuggets that are being recommended to Goodell in this instance, what you can't see is behind the scene, there are thousands and thousands of nuggets that are all in a specific order for Goodell. And that order is constantly changing and adapting based on whatever she's excelling in or whatever she's not doing so well in. So it's not a set order, it's not a rules-based order, it's looking at that wider data set and trying to analyze what Goodell needs next to help her. And I guess in this case, the focus is on closing those knowledge gaps that will exist. How then does that transcribe into data? Well, there's lots of sort of elements when it comes to how and who we present data to, but I suppose the most important bit from my perspective is actually presenting that to students. I think it's really important that we're encouraging students to become lifelong learners and to take ownership over their data. And this dashboard will present everything that Goodell has done, what she's recently completed, the areas that she's attempted, how long she's been on and what regularity she's been on, as well as what her overall scores and time spent on individual courses are. So actually, it's giving students the opportunity to take charge of that themselves, rather than relying heavily on teachers, tutors, and parents to activate that. And that drills down into what recommendations are being made to Goodell. So if Goodell wants to focus on a particular topic, maybe it's physics in Key Stage 3, she can filter that particular course and it will show her everything that she's ever attempted, all her scores, her best scores, her worst scores, how long she's spent, what she's completed, and crucially, what she's being recommended. And I think for me, this is one of the most powerful pages we have on the platform, because it is showing Goodell her relative and most recent strengths. And I say relative because for some students, in this case, for Goodell, 59% is a strength. That is not benchmarked against the national average or the global average. This is benchmarked against Goodell's relative strengths on the platform, and that's fine. 59% in this instance is a strength. Her areas for improvement, recent and relative, of course. And then crucially down here, what the next steps are for either stretch and challenge in those areas of strength, or for those areas to focus on and improve on based on the areas that she struggled in. So scaffolding up what she can do next in order to help her. Hugely powerful, and something we know that parents and students have relied on heavily, particularly during distance learning. We run a lot of parent webinars with schools, and we often get asked questions about how parents can best support their learners at home. I think something that a lot of parents have found incredibly challenging, but a page like this can be a real support and give parents that insight into what the next steps are for the student to progress. So that's what the students are seeing, and that's how we're trying to close those gaps from a student and user perspective. If we think about another type of user now, we move to a teacher. I'm going to start immediately with what we call the interventions graph, because I think from our data that we collect, we see that teachers often go straight to this page as it provides them with the individual students that they need to focus their attention on. So I'll just briefly explain this graph to you. The x-axis is time spent, so monitoring a short amount of study time all the way through to a large amount of study time. And the y-axis is looking at score. So at the bottom, you've got low score. At the top, you've got high score. And then you'll see that my students are plotted relative to each other in different colored dots. And they're put in one of the four quadrants. And if I hover over any of these students, for example, this green student here, I can see that this student is putting in a relatively large amount of study time and getting a relatively high average score compared to the rest of the class. Great. He's doing well. He's on track. I'm not particularly worried about him at the moment. Student over in the left-hand side, in the need stretch area, Miguel. Miguel is seemingly racing through that learning material and still getting a relatively high average score. Now you might say, well, that average score is not high enough. He needs to slow down. But the other opportunity here is that Miguel needs something to stretch and challenge him and to really make him think and slow down. Whereas a student down here in the blue, Pavan, is racing through the learning material but getting a low average score. So actually my intervention for Pavan at this time would be slow down. I want to see you take notes. I want to see 100% completion on the learning materials. And let's see if this helps you increase your average score. And then of course, over here in the bottom right, Maggie is getting a relatively low average score, but putting in a huge amount of study time, over 2 hours on this course. So that, for me, is my focus child. I only have a limited amount of hours in the day, and even more limited in front of these students. So I need to know where I have to focus my attention as a teacher. And this is the child who's in that bottom third, who has been left behind, who has massive knowledge gaps. And that is at this moment where I need to focus my attention if I'm to bring them up to scratch with the rest of the class, up to speed with the rest of the class. Now, obviously, this is quite a reductive example of you wouldn't have 5 students in a class, you're going to have more, but hopefully it displays how we can present data to teachers so that they can focus their attention on the students that need it. And I think this is really great for giving that snapshot. Obviously, there's context required, but hopefully this gives teachers the ability to see where they focus their attention. If we look at this in a maybe more classroom perspective, then I think something like the Mark book, and obviously you will all be familiar with the Mark book, but this Mark book is self-populating. The data enters automatically in a live manner. And what this allows me to see is, if we think about one of those diagnostic assessments, in this case in physics, I can immediately see what the split of my class is. If I was doing this today, I could stamp it by today and just check what the student's knowledge level was at this given time if I'd sat this in class. I could also delve into any of these cells and have a look at how long they've spent on individual assessment questions or diagnostics. So also giving you an insight into their engagement levels, and engagement being one of the things which I think has been most difficult during distance learning and Zoom lessons. How can you gauge engagement levels? How can you gauge that your children are engaged in what you're delivering? This is giving you some insight into that. It also lets you see the areas of strength. Obviously, energy sources, fossil fuel is something that this class is particularly strong in at the moment. And it might also give you an opportunity to have a look at areas where they need more focus, where they need more attention. So hopefully this is a page which gives you that insight, but it also allows you to individually choose students. So you want to focus on someone like Miguel and just have a look at how he's doing in this particular case. And then you can click on any of those individual attempts and actually break it down to see how long he's spent on which type of learning material, and then how long he's spent on each of the individual questions. So what we're doing in terms of data is obviously automating that, making it easier for the teachers so then they're not having to input this manually, and then actually giving teachers insight into whether there's a misconception or whether there's just a silly error or mistake. And in this case, Miguel seems fairly strong in this material. He's skipped through that quite quickly and he's only made 2 mistakes. It's just giving you that little insight that's so often needed. What that then looks like from a classroom perspective and thinking about, well, if we're not doing distance learning, but we're using a tool like this in the class, how can that be used effectively? Here we have a list of every single learning objective that exists in physics. I can focus in on something like kinetic energy. Perhaps I've just set something as a recall activity, or I've set something as an introductory knowledge acquisition activity, or whatever it is being used in the class. I can see that the score is pretty low. My 5 students have completed it. And actually, if I click on the question level analysis, I can see that students begin to tail off at question 4, where nearly all of them got it wrong. And that continues as a theme right through to question 7. And what this is showing you is actually what type of questions the students are struggling with. So velocity is obviously, it's not velocity, sorry, kinetic energy is obviously something which requires an understanding of what kinetic energy is. So they have to describe kinetic energy and then refer to objects with kinetic energy of a pendulum. But we can see that then it introduces elements of mathematics, so calculating kinetic energy. They have 2 questions, relative kinetic energy, and also calculating velocity. And actually, students mostly got these questions wrong. So now, as a physics teacher, I possibly know that this isn't an issue with understanding what kinetic energy is. Rather, it's an issue with the application of maths in a physics setting. And that's fantastic, because that's giving me that insight and saying, well, you need to focus on this element of the learning objective rather than the former element. And again, hopefully saving teachers that little bit of time, saving them reteaching the entire lesson, and giving them a bit more, I guess, efficient guidance as to what students need at any given time. And obviously that then sort of drills down into overview pages of how the class is performing as a whole. We're also very conscious of especially when launching types of technology in schools, making sure that leadership teams have an overview of all of that data and understand how the technology is being used in a consistent manner. I say consistent because when you're investing in this type of technology, there is no point in just having it as an extra nice to have tool. You really need to think about your digital strategy, where it fits in, and crucially, what you're trying to achieve with this. Are you trying to achieve a more personalized approach to the way that you're delivering content? Are you trying to achieve higher attainment rates? Are you trying to increase your progress GL scores? That's really, really important to understand what it is you're trying to get out of this. And then once you understand that, it's looking at the milestones and the roadmap in order to achieve that, because it's certainly not going to happen overnight, and it's going to take a lot of training and CPD to make sure teachers are proficient with using this technology. And a key bit of that is it being used consistently, both in the classroom and outside of the classroom? So we present different sets of data to leadership teams and heads of departments, and that will show overall usage, but also deviations by different demographics of students. So how are girls doing versus boys in terms of score and study time, and then breaking that down by class and by individual student. So are there particular students or particular classes that need more focus? Are there particular individuals who are spending too long in front of the screen and actually need to do something offline and give the technology a break? So yeah, lots and lots of data that's all being automated for teachers and senior leaders to use. And I think I'll just finish with saying that this is not something which happens overnight. It's not something which closing the knowledge gap is not going to be something that you can just wave your wand or have your silver bullet and it's going to be fixed. It's going to take a huge huge amount of work from both providers like us and technology companies, but also, of course, from schools and most importantly, teachers, because lots of students will be in a position where they haven't had access to tutors, they haven't had access to technology throughout the pandemic or throughout distance learning, and so there is a huge amount to catch up on. I know that internationally the examination situation is a little clearer than it currently is in the UK, where we're facing this huge disruption and probably the highest pass rate of GCSEs ever experienced. So it is a little bit different, but yeah, I think hopefully with the augmentation of good technology, data, formative assessment, and the opportunity for students to learn independently in that engaging manner will hopefully ensure that the knowledge gap is not as wide as is predicted or projected by many companies and institutions. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me today. I'll just finish on a thank you slide. And if you do want to get in touch and find out more, we'll be exhibiting at the Guest Leadership Summit, and you can contact me via my email address there, or we have a website where you can learn more about our work in the space of artificial intelligence. But thank you very much, and hope you enjoyed the talk.
That was wonderful and very interesting. Thank you so much, Charles, for your enjoyable presentation and taking us through the platform. If anyone from the audience has any questions pertaining to this session, you can connect with Charles through the networking system on the virtual event platform, just as Charles said. We'd also love to hear from you, so feel free to share any thoughts or comments by sending us an email to marketing@guesteducation.com. We'll be on social media as well during the summit, so you can connect to us there and use the hashtags #guestglobal and #guesteducation. We hope that you enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you, and bye for now. Thank you, Charles.
Thanks.